Thank you very much, Richard, ministers, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back in Dublin. I'd like to thank the hospitality, the invitation by the government of Ireland for the opportunity to be here and share with you some of the thoughts, the work that we've been done at the OECD on Ireland and on productivity more broadly across OECD countries. I think the best way to start really is to quote the Taoiseach himself when he mentioned that productivity is so important for long-term prosperity of countries because it's almost everything that has to do with it. I just wanted to illustrate that with a chart that speaks for itself. If you look at the average OECD country over the last 20 years, what has been really driving long-term or the potential growth of our economies is the bar charts there, which is labor productivity. And why is productivity so important? Because basically it's stagnating. The growth of the rate of growth of productivity across the OECD area used to be, above, on average, above 2.5% per year in the 70s. Now it's less than 1% per year. So this is a very important change because it is one of the key variables that drive long-term economic prosperity in our countries. Not only is productivity slowing down, but it's also diverging across firms, across regions in the same country, across segments of our societies. The Prime Minister mentioned that himself. I just wanted to illustrate one further point about this, which has become a feature of most OECD countries in the post-crisis period. If you see, productivity has recovered only very slowly in the manufacturing sector, which used to be traditionally the key driver of productivity in most of our economies. It is also recovering sluggishly in the case of services, but services are doing better than productivity over the last 8 years or so, or 10 years or so, since the crisis. So another key feature to bear in mind. Let me take you to a third key feature of the productivity story across OECD countries. That is one that is attracting a lot of attention among academics, policymakers, and experts in general. And it is a story about growing gaps between the best and the rest, between the firms that are really at the global frontier, the dashed blue lines that you have in the chart, and the ones that are lagging behind. This gap is growing over time, not only in the manufacturing sector of our economies, which again used to be the key driver of productivity growth traditionally, but also in services. And this growing gap is even bigger in the case of services enterprises. If you zoom in on services, we see that there is even more rapid increase in that productivity gap in the ICT sector, as opposed to the non-ICT sector. And what is even more interesting in the case of the ICT sector is that we are talking about not only a growing gap between the best and the rest, but also a growing gap between the very best and the best. So it is really the case that the very top firms that are so productive, that almost drive the productivity frontier globally, are growing further apart from very high performers, in the case of the best companies, but the ones that are lagging behind. And this seems to be a very specific feature also of the ICT sectors within services. What's behind it? What's behind it is growing heterogeneity in productivity trends across firms. Well, there are several reasons why that is happening, but one that is very interesting is that there are very interesting or very big, large differences in the take-up of new digital technologies among firms. And what you have there in the chart is comparisons not across firms, but across OECD countries. And the red dots there refer to Ireland. So you can see where Ireland is relative to the OECD countries in the take-up of these very different technologies. Take, for instance, the case of social media. Well, the majority of firms in the OECD area already use social media in their regular operations. Ireland does very well, with about 2/3 of companies already reporting in surveys to use that on a regular basis. In fact, Ireland is very close to the best performer in the OECD, which is the diamond that you have there at the top. You look at the other extreme where most countries aren't doing as well, the case of complex cloud computing, for instance. There, Ireland is also doing relatively well. It's above that blue rectangle, which is the average of OECD countries, not doing as well as the top performer in the OECD area, but it's doing well. In other areas, Irish firms are doing less well. You take, for instance, the example of supply chain management. You take the case of enterprise resource planning, where Ireland is close to but below the average of firms in the OECD area. So this heterogeneity in the take-up of new technologies, and bearing in mind that technology is changing very fast in the world nowadays, explains to some extent why there is a divergence in the level of productivity across firms in our economies. There is now a feature of the recovery in Ireland that is particularly worrisome, which is the fact that in Ireland, the productivity in services hasn't recovered as fast as productivity in the manufacturing sector, and the level of productivity in services in Ireland remains below the levels that we used to observe before the crisis. So not only is productivity stagnating, particularly in that sector, which is such a key important sector in the Irish economy, but it's not even at the levels, hasn't even gone back to the levels that we used to see before the crisis. The Taoiseach mentioned himself this feature of the Irish economy, which is about a growing gap between local Irish firms and the foreign affiliates of multinational companies operating in Ireland. If you look at this chart, and I don't expect you to be able to read all the text, but if you see, these are basically a ranking of productivity levels across firms that are foreign-owned relative to Irish domestically owned firms. And most of the gaps, take for instance scientific R&D, which is the top one in terms of gap, the productivity of foreign-owned firms is about 200% higher than the productivity of Irish firms. And most of the gap across those sectors is about the services sectors. So services, such an important sector in the Irish economy, one where productivity growth is stagnating, levels still below the levels that we used to have before the crisis, and with huge gaps in performance between Irish firms and foreign affiliates operating in the country. So those stylized facts of the recovery and the trends in productivity in Ireland and in the OECD area already point to several areas for research and for policy reform, not only in Ireland, but also in other advanced economies. How do we do that? What are the key drivers? What are the key areas where policy can change performance at the firm level across countries? I would say basically that there are two blocks of initiatives that are worth talking about. One is about incentives, how to make sure that firms can adopt or face the incentives to adopt the latest technologies and the most modern business practices in their efforts to improve their performance and improve their productivity. There are several policy areas that are particularly important in that respect. Most of them have to do with market settings. Most of them have to do with entry and exit barriers in the different sectors of the economy. Some to do with labor market policies, others with access to capital, digital trade, and so on. So this is one block of, say, policy streams that governments need to think about. The other one is about capabilities. How to make sure that firms can benefit from ICT by making complementary investments. Here I would like to echo again what the Taoiseach mentioned when he was speaking about skills, about training, and so on. And Julie will follow up on many of these issues in her intervention. But here, I just wanted to mention all policies related to human capital formation, skills, managerial quality at the enterprise level, programs for education and training, programs for job matching, as policy areas that have to do with creating capabilities for firms to thrive in this environment of very, very rapidly changing technologies, and where they can adopt the most modern technologies and managerial practices to improve their performance. Let me start by showing you a few charts for you to have an idea of where Ireland is relative to OECD countries in those two areas of incentives and capabilities. Take incentives first. If you look at these two charts, one very interesting feature of the Irish story is very low business dynamism. What do we mean by that? Basically, by looking at the rates at which firms enter markets, so the firms you can think of it as a startup rate for new firms, as a share of total firms operating in a given sector. And you see that Ireland doesn't really rank among the top performers of the OECD. So the rate of entry of new firms in Ireland is relatively low by the standards of the most advanced economies in the OECD area. And so is the case for the exit of firms from markets as well. So Ireland has what economists tend to call the rate of churning at the firm level, so the difference between entry and exit of firms. It tends to be relatively low in the case of Ireland. So why is that the case? Why is it that business dynamism in Ireland, an economy that is performing so well, isn't on a par with what we observe in other parts of the advanced world? There are a few areas of policy that have to do with firm entry and exit. One is to remove barriers of a more regulatory nature. The OECD has an indicator of regulation in product markets that basically tries to identify those regulatory barriers in a number of areas, in the area of state control of the economy, in the area of entrepreneurship, in the area of trade and investment. And what we see on the basis of these indicators is that Ireland is not doing too badly in terms of state control, in terms of barriers to trade and investment. In this particular aspect of the indicator, Ireland is actually above the OECD average. Here, a higher score means more restrictions rather than less restrictions. But there are issues related to barriers to entrepreneurship that, according to our indicator, could be thought about as areas for potential reform in Ireland. I'm talking about, options for reducing the price of construction permits, for instance, registration of property charged by the relevant authorities in Ireland, permitting the introduction of new forms of legal businesses. If you look at the different sectors of the economy, the restrictions, the regulatory restrictions to entry tend to be higher than the OECD average in Ireland in the legal profession, in some of the utility sectors of the economy, which points to areas where there can be further liberalization of regulations as a way of promoting the entry of firms in those important sectors. Also, issues related to the local business tax, for instance, that adds costs to startups and to firms that are setting up operations in your country. The government has been working on that. I would cite, for instance, the program, the integrated licensing authorization program that exists already in Ireland and goes some way towards making entry easier from the point of view of the burden that it imposes on firms. And there is also the issue of exit. Here, Ireland performs rather well in an indicator that we have that compares insolvency regimes across the OECD countries. In the area of corporate insolvency, Ireland performs rather well by comparison with other OECD countries, but this does not seem to be the case in the area of personal bankruptcy, for instance. And this is very important because if business failure is associated with personal bankruptcy, for instance, and there are difficulties to recover assets, to make sure that assets, when there is a business failure, can be reallocated to more productive firms and more productive uses, that contributes to raising productivity in the country. So these are just areas of policy that affect entry and exit, and then affect market structures, and will in turn affect the incentives that firms have to work on productivity-enhancing measures. Let me turn to the second pillar of the chart that I showed you a minute ago, which was about capabilities. Here we see that there is some scope for raising managerial skills in the Irish economy. The Taoiseach mentioned the case of lifelong learning, which is one that we tended to insist on, especially because, again, we are talking about very rapidly changing technologies and business conditions around the world. If you don't have that agility and that flexibility in training yourselves and your workforces, you are going to be left behind in a world that is changing very fast. And if you look at one of the most known business surveys that we usually have access to, you see that the scores relative, the Irish scores are not really on a par with those of the more advanced economies in the OECD area. The same goes, for instance, for the percentage of population aged 25, and so prime age individuals that are participating in education and training. There we see that the rate is low in the case of Ireland and lower than in the case of other strong performers in the OECD area. So these, again, are areas where policy can contribute a great deal to make sure that the firms that operate in the country can have access to the best managerial skills and the best qualified individuals that can perform strongly in this rapidly evolving global economy, which is so important for such an open economy like Ireland. So to conclude, just a few numbers that show you how Ireland performs relative to other countries, a few areas where there is more room for improvement in the case of the Irish economy, despite the very strong performance that Ireland has had over the last few years, and a few of the policy levers that then governments and enterprises alike can use to improve performance at the firm and at the sectoral level. I thank you very much for your attention, and happy to share any further work that the OECD has been doing if you find that useful. Thank you very much.